James' cat, Mr. Minky, had been missing for 3 whole days when it finally returned one morning with the strange white collar around its neck. And the cat was seemingly not willing to let James touch it under any circumstances. But when James finally got the chance to see what was inside the collar, he did not hesitate a second and called the police. It was not easy to get the strange white collar on the cat's neck, but his curiosity about what it was much greater than the cat's desire to keep the object. From inspecting the outside, he couldn't determine what he was dealing with. He had to break it up. There was seemingly no way to open it up cleanly, and if there was, James did not have the patience to find it. He took a hammer from the garage and smashed the white collar into a million pieces, finally revealing what had been in there all along. James could barely believe his eyes. Who was responsible for this? He only knew that the police needs to get involved in this quickly. But what was in Mr. Minky's new white collar? How had he gotten it in the first place, and why did the police have to get involved? James had his cat named Mr. Minky now for at least 3 years, and the animal had always been an outdoor cat. If he was kept inside the house for a whole day, the cat was mewing and was doing damage all over the place. So James preferred to let his cat outside the house, so Mr. Minky was able to play and enjoy the sun. Of course, James never stood in the way of the animal because he wanted his cat to be happy and not prisoned. Also, James trusted Mr. Minky because he always returned to the house, especially around dinner time. But one day, the cat didn't show up in time at all. James, as the time passed by, he started to worry about his little friend. James spent all the evening waiting nervously for his beloved cat, but Mr. Minky didn't show up at all. This was something that never happened before, so James was worried sick. He didn't know what to do and how to react. He was worried that maybe something really bad happened to Mr. Minky. He tried to make some happy thoughts, but that was not easy at all. That night, James couldn't sleep at all. The only thing that he was wondering about was Mr. Minky and if he is going to return someday back to his home. He was really sad and he couldn't think about anything but his cat. The next morning, the cat was not still returned to his home, so James decided to take action. The first idea that came up to his mind was to call the local shelters to ask if they had picked up his cat and to explain to them what exactly the cat looks like in the case that they come across Mr. Minky. The second thing that he did was that he made some posters and he started putting those up around the neighborhood. Most of the people had seen at least one time Mr. Minky walk around the streets and they loved him, so everybody that James spoke to promised to keep an eye out. James at first was really happy because everyone wanted to help him and he hoped that sooner or later Mr. Minky will be with him again. But the things didn't go as he wanted to. The next 2 days passed with no sight of Mr. Minky, and James started to really get worried that something terrible had happened to the cat. And he couldn't bear that thought. He had a really bad feeling, but it was not easy to do something about it. He had to do something more effective for finding his missing cat. James was all alone in this world. He barely had any family. James never get married and he never had kids. All he had in this world was Mr. Minky. Losing him would mean much more to James than just losing a pet. It would mean he would miss his best friend in the whole world. Luckily, this would not be the case for James as Mr. Minky would return to him as soon as possible. But something had changed about the cat and James would soon find out what. Somewhere deep inside, James hoped that Mr. Minky was sound and safe and he would find him somewhere out playing. It was an early morning, the day that James woke up to the sound of loud mewing coming from downstairs. He shot out of the bed and did not even get dressed before checking. He was really excited because he was about to see again his little friend who he really missed. James' heart was beating faster than ever before, and when he got to the kitchen, he nearly collapsed on his knees, crying out of pure joy and excitement. It was his cat, Mr. Minky. He couldn't believe it in his own eyes. It was like a dream finally came true. The first thing that he did was pet his beloved cat. He didn't believe that he was going to see Mr. Minky ever again. He picked up his confused-looking cat because he really missed him. James started hugging Mr. Minky. Suddenly, he felt something hard that he had not yet seen through the curtains of his tears. He was completely sure that was something new. It was the first time that he observed something like that in Mr. Minky's fur. When James looked a little closer to his cat, he observed something strange. Around Mr. Minky's neck was some sort of a collar with a big white thing. James had not a single idea what he was looking at, but he knew that this was something that he wanted to get off his cat. Of course, he was starting to consider this as the reason why his cat took so long to come back. When James tried to put off the collar from Mr. Minky, the cat made it obvious that he did not agree with this at all. Every time that James tried to touch the collar, Mr. Minky tried to bite him. This was something that the cat normally never did in the past, so James started to become more and more worried. What was this white thing on his collar? When James tried to put off the collar from Mr. Minky, the cat made it obvious that he did not agree with this at all. Every time that James tried to touch the collar, Mr. Minky tried to bite him. This was something that the cat normally never did in the past, so James started to become more and more worried. What was this white thing on his collar? The very moment that James felt that his cat tried to hurt him, he was shocked so much that he unconsciously let the cat fall down. Luckily, the cat landed on his feet, and he was also immediately calmed again. James was stunned by the cat's weird behavior. For Mr. Minky, it was the first time that he did something like that. James had so many questions about the strange white plastic thing that was around Minky's neck. But he also realized that the best thing he could do is to appreciate the fact that his cat was back home and try to spend some time with him without thinking about the collar anymore. James quickly gave Mr. Minky a big ball of food with his favorite canned food. When the cat saw that his delicious meal was ready, he eagerly started to devour it. Also, James took the decision to close up all the cat exits around the house. He felt that this was his only option for now. James knew that Mr. Minky probably would not like it, but for now, he did not want to take the risk of losing his cat again. At least not until he had figured out what the white object around his neck was. He thought that this way he could sleep at night peacefully without being worried all night. For the first day, this did not seem to be a problem. Mr. Minky was obviously tired from whatever he had gone through for the past couple of days. James was wishing that the cat would be okay with not being outside and that both of them are going to have fun. But after some days, things changed. James made another attempt to take the white object from Minky's neck when the cat was asleep. But he woke up because of it, and James had to dodge the claws of Mr. Minky this time. James had no idea what he was going to do from now on, and he was really worried about himself and his cat. James didn't lose his courage, and when the cat fell asleep a second time, James decided to take the smarter approach and just inspect the white object without touching it. But it was difficult to make any conclusions. But James was really determined to find out what was happening with his cat, so he didn't quit trying to save Mr. Minky. James thought and thought, but he couldn't come up with another way to inspect the device without waiting for Mr. Minky to fall asleep. He would just have to be more careful about not disturbing the cat when he got closer. But this time, James had an even bigger problem to worry about. Mr. Minky seemed to be in a deep sleep, but the cat was lying on top of the device. There wasn't any way for James to see it in detail without having to move the cat. Slowly, he decided to risk it again and reached for Mr. Minky as gently as he could. Despite appearing to be in a deep sleep, Mr. Minky woke up immediately and was obviously angry that James was disturbing him. Frustrated, James decided that he needed some insurance that the cat would stay asleep. He considered different options and finally came up with a plan that could work if he was careful. James found a sleeping pill that wouldn't hurt the cat and bought a bottle to keep Mr. Minky snoring away. But when he tried to feed it to the cat, Mr. Minky refused to eat it. James decided to mix the pill in with some food to see if he could trick the cat. Finally, Mr. Minky ate the food and went back to sleep. James snuck over and started checking out the device. As he got closer, he thought he noticed something new. When he watched again, a red light flashed. Suddenly, James was even more disturbed by what the device could mean. Now that James realized the device could flash, he couldn't stop thinking about what it could be for. Instead of feeling curious, he was almost nervous about being around the device without knowing what it could do. What if it was something dangerous? But even if that were true, he'd still have to get it away from Mr. Minky. James slowly grabbed the device and leaned in again to look at it. After already spending so long investigating the object, he was surprised to notice something new. He couldn't tell if it was just his imagination. Was he just being paranoid because of how stressed he was about the device? But even after thinking seriously about whether he was just imagining things, James couldn't deny that it looked like there was a camera on the device. There was a black dot next to where he'd seen the red light flash just a few moments earlier. While he was staring, it went off again. James decided that he had a right to know what was stuck to Mr. Minky's collar. It didn't matter if he destroyed the device because it didn't belong to him, right? The best thing to do was open the device and study the inside. Maybe it would have some kind of marking or serial number. James grabbed a pair of scissors from the kitchen and tried to cut the collar, but the scissors weren't strong enough to cut through the thick band. There wasn't any way he could see to take it off with a snap or buckle. He'd have to find something stronger without hurting the cat. After digging around in his tools, James found a pair of nippers in the garage. They weren't that sharp anymore, but he thought he'd be able to put enough force on them to cut the collar, and he was right. On the very first try, the collar fell from Mr. Minky's neck. James picked up the collar and turned it around and around. When he held it up to the light, he noticed a small button that hadn't been obvious before. He figured that it couldn't hurt Mr. Minky now that it was separated from him, so he pushed it and waited to see what would happen next. As soon as he pushed the button, James heard the device beep in response. A computerized voice stated that it was starting some kind of upload. After a minute, it said, "Upload complete." James had never connected the device to the internet, so he had no idea how it was uploading anything. The answer would shock him forever. James was beyond frustrated. It felt like every time he was making progress, he ran into a new problem that didn't make any sense. What kind of data was on the collar? Was it something totally innocent like information about his cat? Or was the device spying on him somehow? Finally, James decided to stop playing by the rules. He didn't want to waste any more time being confused and thinking in circles. He quickly headed back to his toolbox and grabbed the hammer. It was time to figure out what that device was made of and how it had ended up around Mr. Minky's neck. James set the device down on the table and smashed it with the hammer until the casing pulled apart. It nearly exploded under the force, with tiny pieces flying in every direction. When he bent down and started sorting through the mess, he could finally get a clear view of what was inside. The first thing James noticed was the camera, which he was expecting to find already. But he definitely didn't suspect that the device had a microphone or an antenna to send data on its own. He wanted to tell someone, but who would believe him if he called with such a strange story? Finally, James realized that he couldn't be expected to manage something so unusual by himself. Without knowing who else might help, he called the police and told them that he might be in danger. It wasn't really a lie. After all, he had no idea what the device was for. After James finished explaining what was going on, the police officer promised to send someone immediately. James had expected them to sound a little skeptical, but they didn't doubt him for a second. He wondered if maybe the police knew what was going on with the collar. Had there been other reports? In just a few minutes, the police were at James's house with the lights and sirens running. It was obvious that they were taking him seriously. He wondered whether this was all part of some bigger plot. Before long, the police were standing at his front door and ready to help. Once they were inside, the police explained that several people had called about the white collars. But every time they tried to investigate, the collars vanished before the police could arrive. Maybe the person who put them there was continuing to watch the cats in case they had to get the collars back. James was completely shocked that others were going through the same thing, but the news actually made him feel better. The collar wasn't about him personally. He was just one small piece in a bigger plan that no one understood. James immediately showed the collar to the police, hoping that they'd be able to figure out who was behind it all. The police confiscated the collar and took it as evidence. They said they would get back in touch if they had any other information or needed more details from him about what had happened. James tried to relax after they left, but he couldn't stop wondering about the strange collar. James decided to watch some television with Mr. Minky to unwind after such a stressful day for the both of them. But before he could get too far into his show, the phone rang. He didn't recognize the number and was almost too afraid to answer, but his curiosity won out and he hesitantly picked up the phone. It was the police station calling him with an update. They'd analyzed the device and traced as much of the information as they could. They were able to track down the person who'd made the device and figure out what his motive was for making the collars. The truth was unbelievable. It turned out that a local teenager was creating tracking devices and testing them on cats he found in the neighborhood. He had no idea that he was scaring people when the cats came home with unusual collars. The teenager had simply wanted to make sure they worked since he wanted to start his own business one day.